what progressives and conservatives get wrong. In this video, I'm going to explore the strengths and weaknesses that I observe in progressives as well as conservatives. And as an aside bonus, I'm also going to try to explore the weaknesses and blind spots of my own ideology. I would define myself as philosophically libertarian or classically liberal. When I use the term liberal, I mean it in the traditional sense, say the John Locke sense, certainly not the Nancy Pelosi sense. So in a nutshell, the weakness of progressives is conceit. Progressives tend to overestimate the extent of their knowledge in a particular area that they're trying to change society. They tend to be overconfident in their convictions. And this is coupled with an underestimation of the complexity of society. In layman's terms, they're not as smart as they think they are, and society isn't as simple as they've modeled it in their minds. And because of this, they tend to be really bad at anticipating the unintended consequences of their policies. And I guess the best evidence of this would be the societal decay in progressive strongholds. If you look at areas where progressive Democrats have ruled over for decades, generally think of densely populated urban areas, places like San Francisco or Portland, the inner cities of most major urban areas overwhelmingly vote for progressive Democrats, and those policies don't seem to work very well. In fact, they're often very dystopian. You can look at the homeless problem in many places like California, specifically very progressive areas, San Francisco. Progressive policies towards homelessness don't seem to be tackling the problem, they seem to be exacerbating it. Same thing with criminal justice reforms from the progressive point of view. Oftentimes these lead to explosions in crime rates. In places on the West Coast where they decided to stop enforcing property crime below a certain threshold, well, they saw an explosion in shoplifting. If you're not going to prosecute people who are engaged in shoplifting, well, you're going to get more of that activity. And there's a lot of unintended consequences of that. Big box stores are closing up their businesses and moving out of those areas. That has the effect of destroying the tax base, destroying employment opportunities in those communities, and generally making the area poorer and worse off. So that's just one example of progressives failing to appreciate the unintended consequences of their policies. Now let's look at conservatives. Conservatives tend to be a little bit wiser than progressives, if for no other reason by default. Conservatives tend to be more risk adverse, so they're not going to make radical changes to a system because they're trying to conserve what works. And this approach, taken to an extreme, can lead a conservative to being dismissive of very real problems that need to be addressed and might need to be addressed in a radical way. That being said, the conservative tends to be a little bit more humble in their approach. They tend to be a lot better at anticipating unintended consequences of policies because they're trying to hang on to what is working. So the progressive is more likely to haphazardly pursue a bunch of radical changes in society without thinking through the unintended consequences, without thinking through how their policies might be gamed by bad actors. And conservatives, their default mode might be to resist legitimate reforms that need to be pursued, at least deserve consideration and need to be teased out. So an extreme progressive might be tempted to just want to tear the whole system down and build a new system in its place, failing to appreciate the unintended consequences and the massive disruptions that would cause. The conservative is more likely to continue to want to do something a certain way just because we've been doing it that way for a while, and why change? And at either extreme, there's definitely a ditch to fall into. One of my favorite people on the left to listen to is an evolutionary biologist and podcaster named Brett Weinstein. And he's definitely to the left of me on a fair number of issues, but I still like to listen to him because he's interesting and reasonable in his approach. And while I might not always come to the same conclusions, at least I can follow his reasoning. One of the insights I've heard him express before is something to the effect that he wants to progress society to a point where he can become a conservative. And I think there's a lot of wisdom wrapped up in that idea. There's an understanding that there are things that we need to conserve, there's things that we do right in society, and we really have come a long way. We don't want to screw those things up. But there's also areas where we need to progress as a society. In fact, sometimes we need to progress back to where we were before because it turns out we went too far and we were closer to the ideal in the past. So in my mind, I don't consider myself a progressive or conservative. Rather, I have ideals, and to the extent that the society I live in is living out those ideals, or at least is very close to them, I want to conserve that. I want to keep that golden goose alive and allow it to continue to lay golden eggs. In areas in society where we're not living up to our ideals or where we strayed from them, well, then I want to progress back to a point where we were closer to our ideals. So like I said, I consider myself libertarian, philosophically, or classically liberal. I think in terms of political systems, classical liberalism is the best system. And in a nutshell, a classically liberal political system is trying to limit the power of the state, sort of decentralize a lot of things. And the reason you want to do this is because it allows for a lot of individual liberty and autonomy. So my argument would be that the original Bill of Rights was a very classically liberal document. If you think about the First Amendment, what is it there to do? It's there to limit the power of the state, to centralize control of things like religious institutions or the press. We want a free press where individuals can go out and express their opinion and not be censored by the state, more or less. The same thing with religion. We're limiting the government's ability to establish a religion. That's what the First Amendment does. That allows individuals to go to whatever church or mosque or synagogue that they want to go to and express their religion according to the dictates of their own conscience. So long as they're not infringing on other people's rights, you should be able to worship God or even not worship God in whatever way you see fit. And if you go down the line, I mean, the Second Amendment, again, that's just decentralizing the means of defense, allowing an ordinary citizen to arm themselves and provide for their own security. That's not to say there isn't a place for the state, particularly the state at the federal level, to provide for the common defense. It just means you don't want to give them the monopoly on it. So that's why we have a Second Amendment that protects the right of ordinary people to keep and bear arms. If you look at other amendments, the Fourth Amendment, your right to privacy, your right against unlawful searches and seizures. The government has to have a very good reason to come rifle through your stuff, search your home or your business. And as the Constitution was amended, particularly after the Civil War and that, largely the amendments were there to restrict the power of the government. After the Civil War, Union Republicans wanted to give newly freed blacks the right to vote. In order to ensure that right, they needed to restrict the power of states, particularly in the South, to discriminate against blacks and bar them from voting. It wasn't until the Progressive Era when politicians started to amend the Constitution to actually give the government more power. We saw this with the 16th Amendment, which gave the federal government the power to lay an income tax on individual people. And of course the 18th Amendment, which brought about prohibition, where they amended the Constitution to give the government the power to ban the manufacturing, distribution, and sale of alcohol within the United States. So these amendments passed during the Progressive Era actually stripped individuals of a lot of rights and concentrated more power in the central government. So in a lot of ways they were progressing away from classical liberalism. And of course, at least in the case of alcohol prohibition, there was a lot of unintended consequences of that policy. It seemed like a good idea to a lot of people because alcohol does cause a lot of problems in society. But merely making it illegal didn't stop a lot of people from continuing to consume it. And now you've created a vast underground economy to serve that demand that's still there. And this led to bootlegging, It led to a lot of violent crime as these bootleggers would compete with one another and often settle their disputes with bullets. It led to a lot of corruption because it was a very unpopular law. It made it very lucrative for people to engage in the underground alcohol trade. And these bootleggers and organized criminals had a lot of money to bribe off public officials. So it's just one example of progressive good intentions causing a lot of unintended consequences. I could probably make this video an hour long if I wanted to go into all the unintended consequences of many common progressive policies. Now, the conservative blind spot is to simply want to continue doing something just because we've been doing it that way for a while. So using the same example of prohibition, of course, prohibition was extremely unpopular, and of course they overturned it a decade and a half later in the 1930s. And after alcohol prohibition ended, I think out of inertia, we had a lot of agents in the government whose job it was to enforce alcohol prohibition, and now that alcohol prohibition ended, they needed to find something else to do to justify their existence, and they decided to go after other recreational substances. So let's look at marijuana prohibition, for example. Now, more Americans drank than used pot, so marijuana prohibition was an easier sell. They were able to maintain that for a lot longer, long enough for conservatives to become accustomed to it and now become resistant to changing it. So over the last few decades, a lot of states have outright legalized it. It's still illegal at the federal level, but a lot of states have decriminalized or outright legalized marijuana, even recreational marijuana, much to the dismay of a lot of conservatives. And there are some conservatives that see the merit in legalization, but I think a lot of them just begrudgingly hold to a prohibitionist mindset just because it's something that's been illegal since the late 30s. And it's been the status quo long enough for conservatives to just reflexively defend it. And I think the irony there is, if let's say we had never prohibited marijuana, we never made it a controlled substance, and all of a sudden in 2023 we decided that, or progressives decided that we needed to ban it, I think the very same conservatives would be resisting that prohibition. They'd be arguing, why do we need the nanny state telling us what we can do with our bodies? What substances we can put in them? Are we going to ban cigarettes next? Are we going to ban alcohol? Are we going to ban different types of food just because they might be unhealthy? Why do I speculate that a lot of conservatives would be doing that? Is because, for years I've listened to talk radio hosts rail against statewide smoking bans. Not because they're necessarily pro-smoking, but they view that as government interfering in private affairs. Like if an adult wants to choose to smoke, as terrible of a decision that might be, it's still their right to make that decision. Likewise, if a owner of a bar, private business owner, wants to allow smoking within his establishment, again, that's something a conservative would tend to support. It's their right to dictate their own policy as far as smoking goes in their place of business. And I've listened to them rail against soft drink bans, saying former Mayor Bloomberg of New York was notorious for banning large soft drinks. So you couldn't buy a big gulp soft drink at a convenience store. And I listen to a lot of conservative pundits rail against that. Oh, it's the nanny state. The government's trying to run our lives and micromanage our vices for us. So when it's some new thing that the government wants to intrude on, conservatives tend to resist it. But if the government's been intruding in that area of our life for a while, conservatives are more likely to reflexively just defend it because that's the way we've been doing it for a while. And again, I could make this video longer, going into different aspects where conservatives, I think, just through inertia get it wrong and just cling to policies that are outdated. So where do libertarians and classical liberals get it wrong? So being that this is my point of view, it's going to be the most difficult for me to see my own blind spots, but I'm going to do my best to perceive them. I think the strength of classical liberals is they're really good at getting down to the first principles, and they're really good at teasing out the ideal. For example, we're really good at understanding why free speech is of the utmost importance in a free society, because you can't get to the truth without free speech. You can't get to the truth without listening to a variety of opinions and being able to see through other people's eyes. And free speech allows us to do that. Same thing with freedom of religion. We've seen from the past the horrors that can stem from having the government entwined with a particular religious sect. Now, there's plenty of examples in Europe where if you lived in a certain area and you weren't Catholic, you were basically treated like a second-class citizen, if not outright persecuted by the dominant church. Same thing with the Church of England. If you didn't subscribe to the Anglican Church, at one time you were, again, treated like a second-class citizen. And there's still theocratic societies on the planet today that we could look to and say, yeah, we don't want to end up like that, so we need freedom of religion. We want to keep the government out of it, let people go to the churches they want to go to, let them not go to church if they don't want to go to church. So that's the strength of classical liberals. The weakness, then, is they can have a tendency to discount other social institutions and the importance of those social institutions. So a government built on classically liberal ideals is the best system to have. It's going to decentralize power in such a way that puts a lot of checks and balances on power, at least as far as the state is concerned. And it's the system that's going to lead to the most individual freedom and liberty, the most individual autonomy. But in and of itself, it's not stable. It needs a strong foundation of healthy social structures to keep it stable. And without those healthy social structures, it's kind of like building a fortress on the sand of a beach, next to the waves and in range of the tide. As strong as that fortress might be, the ground underneath it is just going to get washed away and it's going to collapse and give way to something else.
Said I was daft to build a castle on a swamp, but I built it all the same, just to show them. It sank into the swamp, so I built a second one. That sank into the swamp. So I built a third one. That burned down, fell over, then sank into the swamp, but the fourth one stayed up.
So if you like liberty and you like classical liberalism and you want to keep that system stable, you also have to have an appreciation for things like nuclear families. You have to have an appreciation for at least the types of values that a lot of religious institutions try to propagate. So while I think classical liberalism is the best form of government, it still depends on healthy nuclear families and healthy social institutions to help instill the correct values into people so that you have a functioning society. People need to be raised with an appreciation for life and the liberty of other people and respect for other people's property in order for a classically liberal system to stay stable. So while I'll describe myself as classically liberal, my personal values are very conservative because I understand the importance of two-parent households. I understand the importance of investing heavily in the development of your children. I understand the importance of teaching people to respect the liberty and property of other people. You can have the best laws based on the best principles you can imagine. However, if there's mobs of other people's feral children running around looting and rioting, that system is still going to fail to thrive. So I guess that's my politics in a nutshell. I'm conservative in that, in so much as we have a classically liberal system, I want to conserve it. I guess I'm progressive in that where we've strayed from our classically liberal roots, I want to progress back to it, if you want to call that progressivism. And in my personal life, I have a lot of conservative values. I'm very appreciative of faith and family because, if you get those things screwed up, whatever system you got on top of it is doomed anyway. So that's my politics in a nutshell. What's yours? Let me know in the comments below. You've been watching the Fletch Report. If you're hearing this, it means you've made it to the end of the video. But before you click onto the next thing and continue down whatever rabbit hole you're on YouTube or Rumble, I've got a small favor to ask. If you found value in my content and you want to help the channel out, the best thing you can do is share it with somebody else that you think will find value in it. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe if you want to see more. Links to the channel on YouTube and Rumble will be provided below. Additionally, I'm making a Facebook page for the channel as well as a X/formerly Twitter. Feel free to follow me on those platforms as well. If you're feeling exceptionally generous, provided in the description below will be a link to Buy Me a Coffee, which is the online equivalent of a tip jar. Thanks for watching, and thanks for supporting the channel.